Sometimes the first step is the hardest one in any sort of a needlework project. So with Roxie, what I want to do is spend a few minutes just thinking about the design and deciding where I want to start. I like to work samplers from left to right and from top to bottom wherever possible. So I'm going to start in what's going to become the upper left-hand corner of the Roxie Sampler. I have added this pink line to remind myself that the vine part of the border is not actually the absolute corner of the sampler. So I'm going to measure down 3 inches and in 3 inches to find this corner of my sampler. And I'm going to go ahead and baste that line, I think. And that's going to help me make sure that I have these 2 leaves placed in the right position. And then once I have that basted in, I'm going to count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares, which will be 10 linen threads. And in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares or 10 linen threads for this point. And that's where I'm going to start stitching, is this corner right here. I like to use counting pins when I need just a temporary sense of distance. So I've put these pins in 3 inches in each direction. In basting this line, I don't have to go in and out every 2 linen threads, because I'm not really using it to count stitches at this point, but just to make a line. So I just need to make sure I'm going to stay in the right groove. Now, before I baste the line in the other direction, I do need to think about something. And that is that in stitching over 2, I'm going to want to stitch so that I will be beginning near a upright thread. So for example, I could start here or here or here, but I could not start right here. So I'm not going to be able to baste exactly where my counting pin is, and this is just a general measurement. So when I'm starting that other basting thread, I need to make sure that my over 2 is going to land next to a vertical thread, so I can actually start basting right here. Okay, so that's going to give me a nice definition to figure out where to start my first cross stitch part of the border. So I'm going to begin stitching with the color for symbol number 3, and that is number 673, one of the greens. And by the way, your placement, if you are working on the AIDA chart, your counting is going to be a little different. So do make sure that you're watching what your chart says, because I had to redo the chart for AIDA because of the way the Satin Stitch works on linen was not going to work on the AIDA. So these The concept is the same, but your stitch count may be a little bit different. Well, it's going to be a little bit different. So from here, I'm going to come down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares, and in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares to start right here. I'm stitching with 2 strands, and I'm going to use the loop method to start. And as always, I'm dampening my floss to begin with so that it's nice and straight, and there are no little bends and quirks in the thread that can potentially become a knot or a tangle. The needle in the kit that I put together, by the way, is a John James, and it's a number 28 needle. The first stitch is always the most exciting one. So from this corner, I'm coming over 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 threads, and coming down 10 threads. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Now that's the top of my first stitch. So I need to come down 2 more to begin my first X. And on the back, I'm going to pull through the loop, and that's going to anchor my thread. Now before I go any further, I'm just going to double check and make sure that I'm in the right place. So from this basted thread, I was 5 squares down, and from this basted thread, 6 squares in. So let's see if I'm in the right place. So that's 10 linen threads. So from here, I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And from here, I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So I'm in the right place. Now, I'm going to actually turn my work and my chart upside down now, because I like to work in the Victorian cross stitch method whenever I'm doing anything, any kind of a line. When I work upside down, I also turn my chart upside down. So in this first row, I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stitches. When I start the Victorian Cross with a loop method, it doesn't really matter which way I was orienting the fabric to start that first half cross. When I work in the Victorian method, I'm working from right to left, and I'm completing each stitch as I go along. And I believe this is going to be the 7th stitch. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yes, 7. And now I'm going to start a long row of diagonals. And I can still work in the Victorian method to do this. Let's take a look at the chart and see how many stitches I do need in this diagonal row. I'm not going to count the stitches in the straight part because that just gets kind of confusing to me. So not counting this stitch and not counting this one. On the diagonal, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 stitches. And so far I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This will be the 9th stitch. Okay, so this is number 13. And now I'm going to start a straight row. Once I finish this diagonal row and start across this part, I have some decisions to make here. I can skip this empty stitch and keep going and do more of my vine, and then come back and do this part of the base of the what's going to become the strawberry. Or I can do these 5 stitches and do these 3 and keep going. I think that what I'm going to do is the skipping. I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, skip a stitch, do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then do my diagonal again. And now that I'm finishing 5 stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now I'm going to start the diagonal this way. Take one more stitch and then I'm going to go ahead and end this thread before I get too close to the end. If you've watched my stitching tutorials before, you know that on the back I try to keep my buried threads flat. I go under 4 or 5 stitches to make sure it's nice and secure. And then I'm going to cut the tail off what I call dangerously close. I do not leave even an extra 1/4 of an inch. I don't keep a neat back just for the sake of having a neat back, but I do think that it makes a difference when it comes time to framing. Now I'm going to turn this back around right side up, because now I want to do this part of the vine. I just like the idea of getting this corner established before I do anything else. So that's going to be my next move right here. So now on this straightaway, I'm going to have, there's 10 stitches between my dark lines. So that makes 11 and 12 altogether. So I'm going to have 12 straight stitches here. And then I believe I'm going to have 13 again on my diagonal, but let's just double check. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So I have 11 and then 13, and then I'm back to my pattern of 5 and skip a stitch, 5, 13, etc., if I can get that far. Now, you have heard me say and demonstrate that I dampen my floss before stitching in order to reduce tangles and knots. And when I say reduce, I mean I rarely get a tangle or a knot in my thread. But I also think it has the benefit of helping me keep my 2 floss strands, parallel to each other. I do not railroad. There's nothing wrong with it. I just think that it's, for me, I find it to be tedious and unnecessary. I can get my 2 strands parallel without railroading each stitch. And I do that. You can kind of look and see that my 2 threads are parallel here before I even start stitching. So as long as I keep them parallel to each other as I'm stitching them, they're going to be parallel as I pull it through. So I achieve the same thing, without doing it on an individual basis. I do think it's important to keep the 2 strands parallel to each other. You get better coverage and a much neater stitch. So let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This makes 11. And 12, and then I'm ready to start on the diagonal. When I look down the strand and I see that they're not parallel to each other, I just take my needle and put it between the 2 threads and straighten them out. Now I find this needle movement awkward. Of course, my hand is out of sight here, but it's kind of hard on my wrist. So I actually find that if I turn my fabric slightly, then it's a lot more comfortable. So I'm actually going back to stitching the Victorian method, and I can almost hear you asking if that's going to keep my crosses going in the same direction. So let's see if it is. So I have my top stitches slanted this way, my top stitch is slanted this way, my top stitch is slanted this way. So as long as you keep your top stitch going in the same direction, you can turn your work to make it more comfortable. So in essence, I'm doing the same stitch, except that by turning it sideways, I'm actually doing the Victorian cross again. So again, if I was holding my thread, my fabric like this, the way we would normally stitch, I'd be going from there to here, and then over here and down, and then back here and down. So by turning it 45 degrees, 90 degrees, I'm actually back to doing the Victorian cross, and it's a whole lot more comfortable. If anything, I have to watch when I'm doing the Victorian cross that I remember to stop and count, and I don't take my stitching too far. Speaking of which, oh no, I'm not anywhere near 13. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Makes 11. 12. And 13. Now I'm going to do 5 and then skip 1. I do try to stay on camera, but every once in a while I'm paying more attention to my stitching than I am to where the camera is picking up my stitching. So I will apologize now. It's going to happen, I'm sure. So 1, 2, 3, 4, this makes 5. I'm going to skip a stitch. So I actually want to come down 4 threads now. This will make a good stopping point for me to show you another way that I end threads. Yep, this is 5. Again, my purpose in ending my thread this way is to keep the back as flat as possible. So I'm going to work my way back and forth between these 2 lines of stitches. I just call this a serpentine crawl. And I just do that 3 or 4 times. I might overdo it, I don't know. I've never had my threads come undone, so I think I'd rather err on the side of being cautious. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm off camera again. And then once I have done that, I'm going to again cut my thread off what I call dangerously close. And I am never worried about cutting the wrong thing. As long as you can see both tips of your scissors, you won't cut the wrong thing. So once I've got my scissors in place, I can snip that off. So let's look at what we have done so far. That's a start. And now I am going to, I think I'm next going to stitch the leaf that goes here and the leaf that goes here. And then I'm going to treat myself to do the first strawberry. I'm next going to stitch this leaf right here. And this is in the darkest of the greens. And because I want to minimize my counting, which minimizes the number of mistakes I'm going to make, I'm going to actually turn my chart and my fabric upside down, because I'm going to be stitching this in the Danish method, which means I'm going to be working half cross from left to right and back, and then left to right and back, etc. It makes more sense to me when I'm doing a dense area to do it in the Danish method rather than the Victorian. So by identifying, I've got my straight row here, and if I come down to the first diagonal and think about an empty space and then 3 stitches, I think I'm going to be able to easily find this place to stitch. Then I'll do a row of 3 and then a row of 4, keeping the right side even, and then a row of 5, again keeping the right side even, and then I'm offsetted 1 row to do this row of 5, etc. And that should bring me back to my basting line. So my point of reference is my straight line in the first little diagonal stitch. And from that diagonal stitch, I'm going to have an empty space, and then I'm going to have 1, 2, 3 stitches. At this point, I'm going to take my basting thread out because I no longer need it, and do my last 3 stitches of my first leaf. As much as possible, I try to stay true to the original Roxie. I should say Roxana Corson Sampler, with her use of several colors for the leaves, ranging from a really dark green like this one to a lighter version of the vine color. And so you're going to find that that's the case in Roxie as well. So there's my first leaf. Next, I'm going to stitch this leaf. It's in the lightest color green, and although the leaf is the exact same shape as the leaf we just stitched, I'm going to find my starting place in a slightly different way. From here, I've got 2 empty stitches, or empty spaces, and then a stitch, and then I'm going to come over one. So from this corner, if I count down 2, 4, 6 threads and over 2, I'll be in the right place to start this stitch. And then I'll stitch 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches, and then offset just like I did before. So again, from this corner of the stitch, which is already in place, I'm going to count down 2, 4, 6 threads and over 2. So from this corner, counting down 2, 4, 6, and over 2. Now that I've finished this leaf, I can take my basting thread out and start planning the next thing to stitch, which is going to be the base of this strawberry right here. I like to plan out my stitching before I get started. And so as I'm looking at this, this is a good opportunity to work on diagonal rows instead of columns and straight rows. So from here, I'm going to actually stitch up here and come over and stitch this diagonal and over and down, and then up and then down, and then up and then down and up and down, and then I'll be finished. So I have 3 stitches that are going to make the stem. And now I'm going to stitch over to the bottom corner of the base. I have 3 more stitches to do. Am I going to have enough floss? That is the question. I'm really happy with the way that turned out, but since my floss is already pre-cut into lengths and I really had to struggle to get those last few stitches in, that has helped me to decide that from now on, as I'm doing the vine, as I come down, I'll do these 3 stitches and then continue on, and that will give me a little bit more length to manipulate this part right here. So next I get to do the fun part, and that's the 3 shades of pink to form the strawberry. The other advantage I just thought of by doing the stem as I do the vine is that when I'm doing the base of this motif the next time, I can start over here and work straight across in the Victorian method and then go back and forth between the diagonal rows. And I think that that'll give me a little bit smoother finish here. So in doing the strawberry, I think I'm going to, again, work upside down and do the center color first. So what's represented by the star, I'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches, and then 3, and then 1. And then I'll start with this color and work back and forth to here and then down. I don't know, we'll see how that goes, but I do know that I'm going to start with these stitches in the middle. As I finish this stitch on this second color, I'm ready to turn this around so it's right side up again. And now I'll finish what is actually the right hand side of this part of the strawberry. This is not the only way to tackle this part of the stitch, but I think that it works for me. And I like trying to figure out the most efficient way of stitching early on when we have so many of the same motifs to stitch. Of course, that also gives you the opportunity to try different methods and see which one you like best. Before I get into any more stitching, I want to show you where I am right now and give a couple of pointers. One, while I'm thinking about it, I'm working on this leaf right here. I just want to say that if you find that you have picked up the wrong color floss for one of the leaves, I would not rip it out. I think that one of the things that's kind of appealing to Roxie and as well and the original Roxana Corson sampler as well is that there's just a random color choice in the leaves. So don't be alarmed if you find yourself making a color mistake with one of the leaves. I would just not rip it out and fix it. The next thing I want to say is that I've done a little bit of basting here. So let me come in closer and explain what's going on here. First of all, this is my center line. And mainly I stitched that so that I would know where to start the satin stitch border. For this project, I'm going to recommend that you start the satin stitch in the middle and work toward either side. That will make it easier to do your corners. But I also found that stitching the center thing gave me some peace of mind because once I found my center, I folded my fabric in half and saw that was indeed in the middle of my piece of fabric. And that's always a good feeling when you're stitching something, to know that you're not going to run out of fabric. The other basting that I've done here is to talk about what happens if you find that you are missing a floss color, and while you're waiting for it to come in, if you've ordered it to be mailed to you, or while you're waiting to be able to go to a cross stitch shop to get more, how do you work around that? So what I've done here is this top line is going to be the top of my satin stitch, and this line on the far left is going to be the left hand side of that border, and that is 10 linen threads away from this leaf. 5 squares on your chart, and also 10 linen threads or 5 squares on the chart coming down this way. And then what I did was I basted this line, which is 12 threads or 6 squares from this line. And that's where my satin border is going to be. Now, if I was not doing this to illustrate how you can work around if you're missing a thread, I still would have basted this line. And when I start stitching the satin stitch, you'll know how this can be a help. It's an aid or a tool that you can use to make stitching easier. The 2 red lines here represent where that first row of alphabets is going to go. So again, if I did not have the color to work on my satin stitch, or if for some reason I wasn't ready to do that, then doing this little bit of prep, and it really only took a few minutes, I can then start working on my alphabet here. Let's say, for example, if I were stitching in a setting where I was watching a movie with family or having a conversation with a friend, I may not want to be concentrating on the satin stitch and instead could work on my alphabet. Some people also find that although they work primarily in hand, that when they do something like a satin stitch, they like to have their fabric taut in a hoop or Q-snap or stretcher bars or whatever. I'm going to be doing my satin stitch in hand as well, but that would be another reason to do this workaround if you wanted to continue stitching this part in hand and go back and do your satin stitch. A word of caution though, when you're going to use basting threads like this to create the space where stitches are going to go that you're going to fill in later, you have to be really, really careful that you have basted in the correct place. So again, it is 5 chart squares from the edge of the leaves to the top of the satin border. So that's 10 linen threads. Also 5 squares on this side as well. And then the whole satin border is going to be 6 squares or 12 threads high. So I'm going to go back and finish working on this leaf right here. And then I'm going to, I think, work on my alphabet just a little bit. I'm really interested in getting some of these colors in before I get to work on the satin border. Also, let me say that this is probably the first time that I have stitched this much of a sampler before turning the corner. Usually I will work the corner and start the top part of my border and then work the interior lines kind of concurrently, so that when I get over to the side, I know for sure that I'm at the corner. At this point, I'm pretty sure this is my corner right here. This border is so simple that I'm really not, I don't really have any concerns that I have a mistake, because it's so regular. But if you have made sure that you always have the right number of stitches on the diagonal and the right number of stitches on the horizontal parts of this border, then you're going to be fine. When I'm stitching letters, I try to stitch them pretty much in the way that I would write them. I don't go back and forth in rows as much as I try to just write the letter. And in this case, I'm starting at the bottom so I can work the A from the bottom to the top and then back down the other side. Can remove my basting thread now. And before I go any further, I just want to confirm that I'm 4 linen threads, or 2 squares in the chart, away from the basting line that's going to be the bottom of my satin stitch. I thought of another advantage of doing the basting and getting my letters started before really getting into the satin stitch, and that is that I can offer myself some variety. I can do letters for a little while and then work on the satin stitch and then come back to the letters and vice versa. As I'm getting ready to start the letter E, I want to take a look at my chart. This question recently came up from a FAQ on my FlossTube channel, so this is a good chance to talk about it here. If I started stitching this without looking at the next page, I might just stitch this and think that I was done. So let's take a look at that next page. Find the right one here. Okay, right here. So this is where you have a shaded area that indicates a page overlap. And by looking on page B, I can see the entire letter E. And it will make a lot more sense for me to stitch it looking at the entire letter. So this page tells me that there's one square, which is 2 linen threads, between the D and the E. By looking at this page to follow it, I can start my letter E really anywhere. And I'm most likely to start here and stitch over and then tunnel under back and work my way up, simply because I have a good point of reference here. Actually, that's true over the top or the bottom. I could start at the top or the bottom, either one. Now, to get over to this side of the letter E, I'm going to tunnel under the back just a little bit. I don't really want to carry threads unnecessarily from one point to another. And it really only takes an extra second just to slip it under a couple of threads. A couple of stitches, I should say, and get over to the other side. I started the second line of the alphabet, so that's going to put me in a good position to start the herringbone stitch underneath of it. But first, I'm going to come back up here and work on the satin stitch inner border. Let's take a look at the chart and the stitch diagram. I'm recommending that you start with the center of the inner border, and in this case I'm gonna work to the left, since that's the part of the chart I have, part of the sampler I have stitched at this point. I'm suggesting this to make it easier to do the corners. If we start in the middle, then we know the whole inner border is going to be centered. If we start in the corner and work toward the center, we could end up being off slightly. So a couple things to point out about this particular satin stitch. We have a series of triangles, or points, I guess we could say, upside down triangles. The shortest of the two triangles covers 1, 2, 3, 4 squares on your chart. So that's 8 linen threads high. It goes down to the smallest stitch of covering 1 square on the chart. So that's 2 linen threads. At that point, we start working back up to the tallest stitch in the larger triangle, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares high, so that's 12 threads. And then we start going down again to 2 threads, back up to 8, down to 2, up to 12. And just continue that pattern to the other side. So let's take a look at the stitch diagram. Satin stitches, regardless of the shape that's created with them, have several things in common. One of them is that you work in a consistent direction. And for this project, in this part of this project, I'm recommending that we work from top to bottom. The dot is indicating where the stitch begins, the arrow is the direction the stitch goes in, and the number is the sequence. So we're going to stitch from here to here, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 threads high. And then in between every linen thread, we have a new stitch, starting top to bottom, top to bottom. Now I'm recommending that we stitch this way simply because when you start the stitch, all these stitches are going to be starting in a row even with each other. So it's easy to find your place. Where the changes take place is down here. And I find that if I start here and work in this direction, it's easiest to find exactly where I need to stitch. So after I stitch the first stitch, I come back here. And I don't even need to count because I'm just going to stop 1 linen thread short of this stitch. And again, stopping short, stopping short, stopping short until I get down to 2 linen threads high. At that point, I'm going to start making my stitches longer. So again, I don't have to count. I'm going to come, this is over 2, then over 3, over 4, etc. until I get to the tallest one, which is over 12. So back to my basting, that's where I said earlier that even if I wasn't trying to demonstrate what to do if you are missing a thread or if you're not ready to do a certain stitch, I would still leave this basting line in place because that's 12 linen threads from this point. So I won't even need to count my tallest points. When I get to that row, I'll know to start going down again. So the place that I'm really going to have to pay attention is when I am going to move from the tall points to the shorter triangle. So again, at this point, I'm 12 threads high, and I work down to 2, and then I'm going to work up to 8. So that's where it's going to be critical to do my counting. On this page, oh, and by the way, this shows you what the chart looks like. And this is that same part of the satin stitch in the green. It also tells you on this page that we're working with 2 strands of turquoise floss. Okay, so I'm ready to stitch. For this stitch, I'm going to show you a different way to start and end your floss, because the satin stitch does not lend itself well to beginning and ending your thread by tucking it under existing stitches, simply because they are so long that it doesn't give you a secure place to anchor your thread. So I'm going to start with a loop start, but instead of making it as one of my satin stitches, now I'm going to be stitching from here down this way. So I'm going to actually make a little stitch right here that's going to be covered by my satin stitches. So I'm just picking a random place. I don't want to be too close to the base. And I'm just going to come over 2 linen threads. And then, just like with all other loop starts, I'm slipping my working thread through that loop. Oops, sorry, I was off camera. I'm going to slip my needle through that loop and get that nice and secure. And now I'm going to start, and I probably need to get some of my basting threads out of the way. Pull this one out. So that first stitch begins right here. And I'm going to stitch over 2, 4, 6, 8 threads. Now I'm going to clip that basting thread, this one, just to get it out of the way. I use floss for my basting. If you use one of the, fishing line type threads for basting, you probably can get away without taking it out. Okay, so my next stitch is going to start right next to the first stitch. So there's just 1 linen thread in between. I'm going to get this out of the way also. And it's going to end 1 stitch short. So what I do is I find where I ended the last stitch, come over 1 thread and up 1 thread, and that tells me where I'm going to end this thread. And again, starting right next to that last stitch. I ended here, so I'm coming over 1 and down 1. Right next to that last stitch. And from here, I'm coming over 1 and up 1. So you can see where I'm covering my loop method start. So from here, over 1 and down 1. I keep saying down, I'm actually going up, but I'm thinking about going down the slope. So I hope I'm not confusing you with my directions. So next to this one, I ended here, so I'm coming over. And now that stitch I think is over 3 threads. So 1 more, and then I'm going to start going up the slope. So you want to be careful when you're doing that buried, not really buried, that covered up loop start, that you don't do it where the triangle is really narrow. So now my stitches are going to start getting longer by 1 thread. So I end it here so I can come over one and change by one thread, making it longer. Now notice that I'm keeping my two strands parallel to each other. And I'm doing it fairly effortlessly because if I have my two threads parallel to each other, I don't need to do that railroading thing with each stitch. Some people like to use a laying tool with a satin stitch, and it is certainly an option if you're having trouble keeping your linen threads, your floss threads parallel to each other. So now I can just start stitching with making each stitch one thread longer. And I'm not going to count. I just know that when I get up to this basting line, that's my 12. And that's when I'm going to start going down again. The other important thing with all stitching, but particularly with a satin stitch, is to keep an even tension. My stitches, I'm not pulling these tight, because if I do, I'm going to end up with the fabric linen threads being pulled away from each other. You can kind of see how that's happening right here a little bit. So I'm going to have to ease up on my tension slightly to keep that from happening. Now that last stitch, I think, is twisted a little bit. So before I go any further, I'm going to take my needle and just kind of comb between the two of them and straighten them out. So just don't let yourself get too far. So when I look at my stitching thread now, there's some twist in it. So I'm going to simply untwist it until I see that my two threads are parallel to each other. And sometimes, in fact, I'll do this right now, I actually unthread my needle and take my needle and put it between the two threads. Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing. Put my needle between the two threads and separate them. And then use my sponge and go over it. And that's how I can usually keep my two threads parallel to each other without railroading each and every stitch. So now I can see that my threads are parallel to each other and I can proceed with my stitching. And just like that, I'm up at the top of the row here. So that's my tallest or longest stitch. Now I'm going to start making each stitch slightly shorter by just one linen thread. So again, I'm going to get this out of the way so you can see. Let me clip that. So now I go to my tallest stitch, come over a thread, and change by one linen thread, making it shorter. Now, if you do the satin stitch, if you're using an embroidery hoop or a Q-snap or stretcher bars or whatever, it's important to make sure that the tension you put on your fabric is the same as what you will put on it when you're mounting your finished work. If you over tighten your linen in your hoop, and then when you go to frame it, if you don't put the same tension on your fabric, your stitches will actually look too loose. So earlier when I was talking about basting, I mentioned that, there are times that you're not going to want to do your satin stitch because of other things that are going on. So I think now that you're watching me stitch, you can get an idea that when you're doing the satin stitch, you really want to be sure that you have the time and the patience to do the work and do it well. Now, as I'm getting close to the end of this strand, there are a couple things I want to say about that. I pre-cut my floss to a length that makes sense for doing the cross stitch. Satin stitch, as you can see, eats up a lot of thread very quickly. So stitching with a 30-inch or 32-inch piece of floss that's folded in half is really too short for the satin stitch. But I did want to show you what it's like to start the satin stitch with that little loop thing. But here on out, I'm going to be stitching with my 2 strands and not use the loop method, simply because, as you can see, there's just not very much that I get done with 1 strand. So to end, I'm going to end with a modified pin stitch. Now I want to make sure that I am placing this where I know it's going to be covered. So remembering that my shortest stitch is going to be 2 linen threads high, and it's coming up pretty quickly here. So I'm going to have a stitch here and here, and then at that point I'll be where it's 2. So I'm actually going to come over here with my thread, and I'm going to make a tiny little stitch like this, and then I'm going to come over 1 more thread, and I'm going to pierce these 2 strands and come between 2 of my linen threads. And that should secure it. Now, if in doubt, you can always come over 1 more linen thread. So in a way, what I'm doing are little teeny tiny back stitches, but I'm making sure that I'm piercing my stitching thread. And I'm going to pull this to the back. Now, a lot of people pull it to the front and then cut it off, and especially if you're working with a frame, that might be more convenient. But I like the idea of leaving the thread on the back. So, okay, this is in fact, I'm going to get rid of some of this. This is my basting thread, which I just want to go ahead and get rid of that. And then this is the thread that I've just anchored, and I've carried it across here, which is going to be covered by my satin stitches. So you'll notice on the back that your stitches look almost the same, but they're just slightly slanted compared to how they look on the front. So now I'm going to start with that same type of a pin stitch when I start my next strand. And actually, frankly, if I had not pre-cut my threads, and if you haven't cut yours yet, I would have cut my threads about 60 inches so that when I folded them in half and started with that loop method that I showed you, I could have stitched twice as far with the strand. Now, I don't recommend stitching with something that long when you're doing cross stitch, but you can see where each time that I'm taking a stitch, I'm not dragging my floss through the linen fabric as often as if I had filled the same area with cross stitches. Hope that makes sense. So now I'm starting my next strand, and I'm going to put my pin stitch right next to, or right below the pin stitch I already have in place. And this time I'm kind of working it in the opposite direction because I want to end up with my working thread over here so that I can be ready to stitch the next part. So I came over to the right by one thread. And now again, I'm going to pierce between those two floss strands and come between those two linen threads. And now I'm ready to pick up where I left off. So I'm coming over one linen thread here. And I'm going to end by coming over one and down one. I want to make sure that I'm catching this thread on the back, which I did not. So I'm going to slip my needle under that thread right there. So I'm catching it and can pull it down in place. I feel like my tension's really loose, and yet I'm seeing that I've got this little gap right here that I don't really like very much. I can see where my linen threads are getting pulled together ahead of where I'm stitching, and that's not good. Okay, so this is my shortest stitch. I'm just going to be over two threads. And now I start making my stitches longer. So I've got half of a short triangle and a full large triangle done. Now I'm going to start making each stitch one stitch longer. So you can see where you place your pin stitch is really critical in the satin stitch to anticipate where your satin stitches are going to lie to make sure that your pin stitch is going to be covered. So once you get started, this actually works up very quickly because the stitches are so long. But again, because the tension is important and keeping your two strands side by side is important, and of course the counting is important, this is a stitch that I would not do when I have distractions, or if I stitch watching a TV show or a movie, which I often do, or a sporting event on TV. I don't want to do this stitch when I'm trying to concentrate on something else. And so now the thing that I have to really think about is how tall my tallest stitch is going to be. I actually thought about stitching a second basting row. So I would have, it sort of acts as a stop sign. That's what I think of this basting row as my stop sign to know when to stop making my stitches longer. So where am I with this one? So if this is my baseline, 2, 4, 6, 8. Yeah, so I'm at my longest stitch right now. So it's a good thing I checked. So I would say that's the thing that you really also have to concentrate on, is it's very easy to get distracted and, you know, keep stitching and make too tall or long triangles in a row. So now I'm going to start making my stitches shorter. So from here I'm going to come over one and make this stitch one linen thread shorter. And it's nice to have nice plump stitches like this with the 2 strands, but it can also hide a linen thread, especially the skinny linen threads. So that's the other thing too I would tell you to be careful about, is that it's very easy to skip, or I should say to jump over 2 linen threads instead of just one as you're moving from one satin stitch to the next. So I'm just going to keep stitching here. I think I've shared with you all the tips and pointers that I have. Oh, you might be wondering why I'm poking and pulling and not sewing. I have not mastered good tension on my satin stitch by doing it as a sewing stitch. Maybe that's something I should work on. But and so now I can relax a little bit, because now I'm getting ready to do one of the bigger triangles. So I'm just going to keep working until I get to my basting line. Take out a little bit. In fact, at this point, I can really get rid of this whole basting line. I don't really need that anymore, because there's no change as you're stitching along here. And I'll clip my stop sign basting thread as I go along. Try this sewing method again. Well, I just tried something new, and I think I kind of like it. Just remember to always check that your threads are parallel and make whatever correction you need to make before you go too much further. Oh, one other thing about that. There are many good instructors who will tell you that when you're stitching a satin stitch with 2 strands, that rather than stitching with the 2 strands together, that you stitch with a single strand and do 2 stitches in each place. So if I were stitching with 1 strand, I'd be going from here to here and then repeating that same stitch again so that I end up with 2 strands in the same stitch. I find that to be tedious and time consuming, and I don't get better results. So it has not worked for me, but I do want to mention it in case you have been taught that way, and if you succeed in making pretty stitches by doing the 2 single strand stitches in the same holes, then by all means keep doing that. So now I'm at my tallest thing, and again I'm going to get rid of this basting thread right here. Not rid of it entirely, because I will need it again when I get to my tallest point. If you don't have a basting thread, keep in mind that your longest stitch, and if you have your letters done, will be 4 threads away from your letters. So now I'm just going to work on over to the corner. So I'm at the end of my second strand. This is the longer one. And again, I'm going to end it with kind of a modified pin stitch. Taking a little back stitch over 2 threads, coming 1 thread further to the left, and coming back, piercing between those 2 threads, and also between the 2 linen threads. And then just for a little bit of added insurance, coming 1 linen thread further along, and coming back and stitching between my floss threads. And on the back, I want to make sure that I trim that off fairly closely. Now this traveling thread is going to get covered by my next stitches. And while I'm here, I want to come back. I neglected to trim off these threads after this was the beginning of my second thing, and so I want to take care of that now. I really don't like leaving strands on the back of my fabric, so I'm going to go ahead and cut those off. And there we go. So now we're adding another color to our color scheme, and that turquoise is really popping. So I'm just going to keep working until I get over to the corner. I'll start my next strand with a modified pin stitch again, just a little bit beyond and above, I should say below this one, and just keep stitching. Now I'm at the point now where I'm going to keep getting my stitches longer till I get to my basting thread, and then go short again. While I'm thinking about it, I want to look ahead to the diagram, and a couple things to point out here. Once I get this done, let's see, right now I'm right about right here. So I have this big triangle, and then a small triangle, big one, then another small one. And then when I get here, this is where I'm really going to have to watch where I am to complete this to the corner. And I'm going to give you some tips on that when I get here. Also, while I'm thinking about it, just to even off the diagram, I have these 2 little tiny stitches, which are each half of a square, which means they're over 1 linen thread. And we'll see whether or not that's going to work when we get there. In general, I don't like to do satin stitches smaller than covering 2 linen threads, but we'll see the pros and cons of doing doing the satin stitch over 1 when we get to the corner. As I'm getting close to the corner, I wanted to start the video again so I can give you a couple of tips. While I'm thinking about it, I want you to take a look back here. Let me come in close. This is a spot where there's a thicker than normal linen thread, and so it looks like there's a gap in my satin stitch, but that's just an optical illusion because we've got that thicker linen thread in there. So just be aware that that's going to happen from time to time, and that's just the nature of linen, and most people, including me, just see it as not a flaw, but just a characteristic and something that makes linen look like linen. So at this point, I'm on my last full triangle here and working down to the last short stitch. I don't want to pull this out entirely so we can see where the corner is, but I want to come down to my last stitch in this triangle, which of course is 2 threads high, and then start up again. Now the basting thread that I've added here that's on the diagonal, that is where the corner is going to be mitered. And if you are a quilter or you've worked with wood, paper crafting and whatnot, you're aware what a mitered corner is when 2 things come together at a 45-degree angle to create some symmetry. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to continue with my baseline being straight across, always in line with each other, and I'm going to keep making each stitch graduating up by 1 thread until I come to my basting thread. So I have 1 more stitch to do here, and then I'm going to be intersecting with that basting thread. Can you see that right there? I'm going to go ahead and leave that thread in there. Now again, the next stitch starts even with my baseline, and now I'm coming down by 1 thread, which stays in line with that diagonal basting thread. And I'm going to keep decreasing by 1 until I come to the corner. So at this point, I can take this out, I think. Now I'm continuing to stitch between the linen threads and keeping my 2 floss strands parallel to each other. And with that last stitch right there, now that's 2 threads high. My next side, I'm going to go ahead and start this, is actually going to start right here, and is 2 threads. And now coming down the side, my base is following this basted line. And for the first part, I don't have to count. I'm just going to meet my mitered line, and I'm sharing holes. So each one of these stitches is going to end in a hole, a shared hole with that first part of the miter. I'm going to get some of this basting thread out of the way. And get my scissors. Okay, so now each stitch is gradually getting longer, but again, I'm not bothering to count. I am keeping my stitches all beginning in the same channel or gap between linen threads, like this. Okay, now, at this point, I'm going to mirror the same design that I have here. And I'm going to keep each stitch beginning so that's even here. And so now at this point, my stitches are going to start getting smaller. So that's where that stitch ended. So I'm coming down one and in one, so it's slightly smaller until I get down to my stitch that's 2 threads high. Whoops. Okay, now can you see where I'm actually in the wrong place? And I just want to point this out to you, how easy it is to find yourself in the wrong spot. So make sure you're not skipping between any linen threads. Okay, so before I go any further, can you see where the fact that this corner is not a really tight corner can be bothersome to some people? So I want to come back and show you one alternative. And by the way, although I'm doing this out of order here, I recommend that you decide how you want to do the corner and do it as you're working this. So since I'm almost out of thread anyway, I'm going to show you 2 different ways that you can finish this off. One is to, as per the diagram, make stitches that are just over 1 linen thread. So you'd need 1 right there and 1 right here. And that kind of fills it out and gives you a sharper corner. So that's an exception to the rule, where making a tiny little stitch over 1 will kind of fill that in a little bit. The other alternative is, instead of doing that, is to make 1 diagonal stitch. So let me show you what that looks like. So the third option is to make a single diagonal stitch. I'm putting my needle in what is actually the corner of the pattern, and then coming over the 2 threads into that shared hole. So that's your third choice. So you can leave it as it was, with the corner just being the 2 stitches meeting that are each over 2. You can make go all the way to the corner with stitches that are over 1, or you can do this sort of a it looks almost like a bird's foot, where you actually have 3 stitches that are coming into the same shared hole right here where my needle's coming out. So all 3 stitches went into the same hole. I have my stitch over 2 on the top, the stitch on the corner, and then the stitch over 2, and then continue. I personally think I like that look the best. It gives a nice sharp point to the corner without stitching over 1. So I'm going to continue with a pattern on this side. Remember that your longest stitch is still going to be over 12 threads. If you already have your alphabet started, you will end up with 4 threads unworked between the edge of your letters and the top of your border. I'm going to do a little bit of that stitching, and then I'm going to come back and we'll do the herringbone stitch together. And there are actually 2 different herringbone stitches in this project. They are both executed in the same way. but they look very different because the first one is what we call a two-trip herringbone, in that we will actually stitch over the same area twice using two different colors. The other thing that makes them look different is the actual stitch count for each one of the two stitches. The herringbone stitch can be tall and skinny, it can be short and squat, and everything in between. So we need to look at two things. First, the chart. And you can see on my preliminary chart here that there's just a dark circle here, but it will actually have a number 2 there on your copy. And this is the two-trip herringbone. And you can see that it is 3 squares tall, which of course is 6 threads. And you can see that it's a very symmetrical stitch. The slant of each one of the stitches is the same. We're always going over a 45-degree angle. So not counting our compensating stitches, which I'll talk about in just a moment, the stitch is 6 threads high and 6 threads wide. Whereas when we do the other herringbone stitch in this section, which you'll have a number 3 here on your copy, the stitch is still 6 threads high, but it's only 4 threads wide. So let's take a look at the stitch diagrams now. So for the two-trip herringbone, you're going to be using the 2 shades of periwinkle. And we're going to start with the lighter of the 2, which I think is listed as medium on your color code. The first trip, we're going to follow the diagram with the numbers, and then the second trip will follow the diagram with the letters. Now, stitch number 1 and stitch letter A are both what we call compensating stitches. They are there to kind of even out the design element. If you can imagine, stitch A, actually, if I had done the whole thing, would have come all the way down to here. So a compensating stitch is when you are filling in an area where the whole original stitch doesn't fit. So again, we're going to start with what's diagrammed in blue, the numbers on your chart here. And again, the dot is where the stitch begins, and then the arrow is the direction we move in for that stitch, and the number is the sequence. So we're going to start here, and the first compensating stitch will just come over 2 linen threads wide and high. So it will look very much like your typical half cross stitch to you. You're then going to scoop under these 2 threads, and then this is where we actually start doing the whole stitch. So stitch number 2 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 threads wide, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 threads high. So that stitch, we're going to start here and come all the way over 6 threads, scoop under these 2, and then come down 6 and over 6 and skip up these 2. And notice between stitch 1 and the next stitch here, there will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 threads unworked. That's why I say this first one is very, very symmetrical. So before we get into the second trip, we're just going to concentrate on this first trip, and I'll get you started. Now the stitch diagram shows you, of course, how to do the stitch. Let's go back to our chart now to see where the stitch is placed. So I have the first 2 rows of the alphabet started, and I have enough of it done that I can get the herringbone stitch placed. So there will be 2 unworked squares, so that's 4 linen threads between the alphabet and your herringbone stitch. And then there'll be, once we get that in place, there'll then be 2 squares, which is 4 threads between the bottom of that herringbone border and the lowercase alphabet. So the whole herringbone border that we're doing here, again, is 2, 4, 6 threads high. So I need to find the place to do this little compensating stitch right here. And that's where we're going to start. And just to make it easy, I'm going to start with a loop method. And I'll show you other ways of getting this stitch started once we get the pattern established. And I can already see where a little bit of basting may have been a good idea, because I have to come down even with this letter T, which is right there. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 linen threads that will remain unworked. And I'm going to come down a further 4 to start my herringbone stitch. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm just going to do my little half cross here. So it's 2 threads wide and 2 threads high. My next stitch is going to start right here. And I'm going to be 2, 4, 6 threads wide and 2, 4, 6 threads high. I'm going to scoop up 2 threads, make sure my 2 floss strands are parallel to each other, and then from here I can count over 6, so 2, 4, 6, and down 2, 4, 6, and scoop up 2 threads. Now let's check a couple things here. First of all, do I have 6 threads between these stitches? So I have 2, 4, 6. And am I 4 threads away from my T? So 2, 4. So I'm in a good position here. I'm going to make this focus a little closer here. So now what I can do is come up here and count 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 threads. Whoops, I lost my place. 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and pick up 2. Now, why did I do 8 when I'm talking about 6? It's because one easy way to do this stitch is to not think in terms of where the stitch is going, but where it relates to the last stitch. So I need to have 2, 4, 6 unworked threads between my stitches. So I can do the same thing down here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, pick up 2. Double check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You want to keep your threads, as I said, parallel. You want your stitches to be taut, not tight. This is not a pulled thread stitch. Notice that each time my needle is pointing to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, pick up 2. And that's the first trip. So I'm going to keep working until I run out of thread, and then I'll show you how to end the stitch. As I'm getting close to the end of my thread here, I am going to stop before I get too close to the end, because I'm going to need a little bit of extra thread for securing this than what I would normally need. I'm also finding as I get close to the end that I'm having to spend a little bit more time making sure that my two threads are parallel to each other. Okay, I think this is going to be my last stitch. So for the last one, I'm going to come over 2, 4, 6, 8, and just go to the back. I'm not going to be scooping up two threads like I have been. Now, I played around with beginning and ending this with a pin stitch, but I could not find a way of making it truly invisible. So I'm going to show you what I call the serpentine crawl. When I carry my thread on the back, I'm going to, as much as possible, be right behind these stitches so that I won't have a shadow when I frame this. So on the back, and I probably should have pointed this out before, because I think it does help to learn a stitch by looking at the back. You're going to have a series of little tiny stitches like this. If you have anything else, then you need to go back and look at what you're doing because something's not right. So I'm going to slip my needle under this stitch below the one that I just finished, and then come up here. So this traveling thread on the back is now directly behind the stitches I just did. And as you can see, I'm doing quite a bit here because it's such a loose sort of ending that I really want to be extra careful about securing this thread. I think it's also a good idea, if possible, to then secure it under some neighboring threads here. So I'm just going to, just for a little added insurance, I'm just going to scoop under these stitches where this letter is. And now I'm going to cut that off now, as soon as I find my scissors, and show you how I start the next. Once you get started, the herringbone stitch goes very, very quickly. You can see that that single strand, I mean, it's 2 strands of floss I was stitching with, but that first length of floss I was using got me all the way over to the middle of the sampler. So that's, I only have a little bit further to go. I'm going to start with kind of a crazy loop method here. I'm going to slip my needle under my last little sideways stitch here, and then put my needle through the loop. So I'm not, so I'm really connecting this loop to a stitch, not to my fabric. So it's just connected to one of the little sideways stitches like this on the back, the last complete one. And I'm going to be bringing my needle up approximately here to finish that pattern. Remember, when we finished that last stitch, I didn't scoop under 2 threads. So now with my thread anchored, it's actually anchored under this little stitch right here. Now I'm coming over 2 threads. Let me come in closer here. I now have moved over 2 threads from where I ended that stitch. And now I can just pick up where I left off, coming from here to 2, 4, 6, 8 threads and scooping up 2. 2, 4, 6, 8, scooping up 2. So this is where on the back, that's where I attach my little loop, and this is where I brought my thread up to the front, and now I'll just have these little tiny stitches on the back, just like I did before. So when I get to the other side, I would finish it the same way. Now, what I'm going to do right now, though, I'm going to stitch just a little bit, and then I'm going to park this thread, because I really want to wait and be able to anchor it under the letters that are going to be over here. So if I had all those letters done, then I would keep working. But for right now, I'm just going to get this established and then park this thread and go back and do the second trip. I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. I'm somewhat ambidextrous, so I'm going to attempt to show you the herringbone stitch in a left-handed method. And of course, the diagram is included in your chart. So you're going to start with a half stitch. That's your compensating stitch, just as demonstrated for the right hand method. And the next stitch, which is your first full stitch, you're going to come from here over 2, 4, 6 threads and up 6 threads. So 2, 4, 6, and scoop up 2. From this point, I'm going to count over 2, 4, 6, 8 threads and scoop up 2. This will allow 6 unworked threads between the stitches. So each one of these stitches, not counting my compensating stitch, each one of these is 6 threads high and 6 threads wide. So counting from this point, I've got 2, 4, 6, 8 threads. Oops, that's not 8. 2, 4, 6, 8 threads and scoop up 2. Now I can double check and make sure that I've got 6 threads between my stitches. 2, 4, 6. 2, 4, 6. It's really important to establish the pattern correctly here, so that when you do your second trip, the stitches will nestle perfectly between these stitches. 2, 4, 6, 8, and scoop up 2. Now, because we need to work this row right to left when you're left-handed, you may need to turn your work upside down if you have started as I did on the left-hand side of the sampler. Oops. I knew it would be a challenge to stitch left-handed, but I didn't think it'd be a challenge to count left-handed. Let's see here. 2, 4, 6, 8. I realize I use my needle as a counter, and developing fine motor skills with my non-dominant hand is an interesting challenge. So that's the first trip of the two-trip herringbone. Your compensating stitch and then your regular stitches. When I talk about parking a thread, this is what I'm talking about. I just take these big loopy stitches just to get my working thread out of the way until I'm ready to use it. I've done the same thing up here. I got this far with my vine border and I wasn't ready to turn the corner yet. So instead of ending the thread when I know that I will have more stitching to do, I just parked it over here. Now, the next trip on our herringbone stitch is the light periwinkle. I've already threaded my needle here. And I want to look at the stitch diagram to see where that's going to be placed. So now we're looking at the stitches with letters rather than numbers. So again, we're going to start with a compensating stitch, which will look just like a half cross stitch. And that's a good opportunity to use our loop method. So we'll go from here to here. We're going to scoop under 2 threads. And these stitches are actually done the exact same way. Except now when I come down here, I'm going to have 2 unworked threads between the existing stitch and my new stitch. I'm basically going to be filling in here and then come up here, scoop up these 2 threads and keep on coming down. So the second trip will go much faster than the first trip. If you take your time with the first trip and make sure you always have 6 unworked threads between your stitches, then you'll have the exact place to put your second trip. Since I'm doing a loop method here, I'm going to begin with that compensating stitch, which is actually a half of a cross. And because I'm using the loop method, the direction doesn't really matter as much as the placement. So it's 2 linen threads above this part of the first trip, and it will end 2 threads away from this one and covering 2 threads. So now that I've got that established, I can start my next stitches, which, like I said before, are just going to be placed right between my existing stitches. So I can, from this point, I can just come in 2 threads, scoop up 2 threads, and I'll have 2 threads between this stitch, my first stitch and the first stitch of my first trip and the first stitch of my second trip. Be coming a little bit closer here. So it may be easiest to work from this point, come ahead 2 threads, scoop up 2 threads, and pull it on through. So just like the first trip, my needle is always pointing to the left, and I'm basically picking up the middle 2 threads of these 6 threads that are between this point and this point. And that's all there is to it. And so you'll see that This is filling in and making a more solid divider border. And it's an interesting way to add depth and texture to your work. And that's all there is to it. That's the two-trip herringbone. For the second trip, we also start with a half cross as a compensating stitch. And now these stitches are going to nestle right between the first trip stitches. So I can just pick up the 2 middle linen threads of the 6. So I'm leaving 2 unworked on either side of each one of these stitches. So from here, I'm picking up these 2 threads, and now my needle is still pointing to the right with each one of my stitches. So when you're doing your second trip, you have to do very, very little counting. You're simply skipping 2 threads, picking up 2 threads. Well, simple if you're left-handed. Picking up 2 threads and leaving 2 threads on the other side. And that's it. Now that I've stitched in my lowercase alphabet, I'm in the right place to be able to add the next herringbone divider border, which is going to go right along here. So taking a look at the chart, you see that there's a compensating stitch that begins this row. The height of the entire row is 3 squares on your chart, which means it's 6 threads if you're working with linen or any even weave. This stitch is executed in the same way as the two-trip herringbone that we did up here. The difference is that these appear to be taller and skinnier. Now again, this row was 6 threads high, and this one's 6 threads high. But what makes it look different is that when we get ready to do the whole stitches, not the compensating stitch, each one is going to be 4 threads wide and 6 threads high. So it's 2 squares by 3 squares, which is why it looks so different from the first one. Plus the fact that it's not a 2-trip herringbone, it's a 1-trip herringbone. So we're going to start with this compensating stitch, and I'm stitching with 2 strands of the golden yellow color. Now I should also point out that we're leaving 2 squares, which is 4 linen threads unworked, between the alphabet row and the top of the herringbone row. And if you still have your basting line in place for the tips of the tall diamond shapes or triangle shapes, we will be 2 squares, which is 4 linen threads away from that line. To find my place to begin, I'm going to use the letter A as my starting point, because the edge of this A and the edge of my border line up evenly. So from the bottom of the A, I'm going to come down 2, 4, 6, 7 threads to find this point right here. Now before I begin my actual stitching, let's take a look at the stitch diagram. The stitch number 1 is your compensating stitch, and this is the point I'm going to find on my linen. And so from there, I'm going to come over 2 and down 1, 2, 3 to make this slanty stitch. And I'm starting with a loop method, so that's going to actually be securing my thread as well. And then from that point, just like when we did the other herringbone stitch, I'm going to scoop up 2 threads. And this time, I'm going to cross over 1, 2, 3, 4 threads and go up 2, 4, 6. So the first one is 2 threads wide and 3 threads high. From then on, it's 4 threads by 6 threads. So counting from this point right here, I'm coming down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And from there, I'm coming over 2 and down 1, 2, 3. And on the back, I'm going to secure my thread with the typical loop method. Now that's the only time we're making a stitch like that. That's a compensating stitch. So now from that point, I'm coming over toward the left by 2 threads. And now I'm going to count over to the right a total of 4 threads. So that's 2, 3, 4, and come up 6. 2, 4, 6, scoop up 2. Now before I go any further, I'm going to double check and make sure I have 4 threads here. So yes, I do. Now we want to make sure that we're keeping our 2 strands parallel to each other. And now the beauty of this stitch is I can just skip 2, 3, 4 threads and scoop up 2. And that leaves 2 threads unworked, just 1 square on your chart, between stitches. And then up here, same thing, skip 2, pick up 2, my needle's pointing to the left. I'm making sure my threads are parallel to each other. And then I come down here, skip 2, pick up 2, and just keep stitching like that. When I'm not sure if my threads are parallel, I'm going to take a moment and use my needle to comb between the 2 and make sure that they are parallel. That's it. Once again, on the back, we have a series of little stitches, and that's what we're going to use to anchor our ending thread. So we'll scoop under this stitch right here, then come down and do this one, and just go back and forth. And since we have the opportunity to do so, we're going to go ahead and also anchor it under a couple of stitches within the lowercase alphabet. Now it feels nice and secure. And as always, we're going to cut that off. And you've heard me say this before, what I call dangerously close. And as long as I can see the 2 tips of my scissors, I know that I'm not going to cut the wrong thing. The one-trip herringbone is done in the same method, just the count's a little bit different. Our compensating stitch is 2 linen threads wide and 3 linen threads high. So 4 threads from our starting point and up 6 threads. So 2, 4, 6. I'm going to scoop up 2. My needle is pointing to the right. And now from here, I'm counting over 2, 4, 3. 2, 4, scoop up 2, and that leaves 2 threads between stitches. So from here, count over 2, 4, scoop up 2, pull your needle through. So these stitches are taller and slimmer, and consequently closer together. So now at this point, I've taught you all the stitches and given you all the tips that I need to give you, and I'm going to keep working over here on the right hand side. I think that next I'm going to finish this row of this alphabet and this row as well, and then I'll be secure in knowing that my count is correct. I'll continue across the satin stitch and turn that border, and then at that point I will be ready to finish turning this corner and come down the other side.